The wind rolled across the wide Wyoming plains, tugging at the grass and carrying with it the sharp scent of sagebrush. A hawk circled high overhead, and below, a lone rider dismounted at the edge of a sprawling ranch. The house wasn't grand, but it was sturdy, timbers weathered by years of sun and storm. Behind it stretched corrals and barns, the kind that spoke of hard work and survival rather than wealth. Caleb Hart wiped his brow and glanced toward the horizon. Clouds were gathering, heavy and gray, promising rain. He could use it. The land was dry, his cattle restless, but it also meant a long night of work. A man couldn't afford to be soft out here. He had no wife to tend the home, no family save a few hired hands who drifted with the seasons. The ranch was his alone, and it wore on him more each year. He had just unlatched the barn gate when he noticed her. A figure, small against the sweeping sky, walked up the dusty lane. She carried nothing but a worn satchel slung across her shoulder, and her dress, plain, faded calico, clung to her from travel. She wasn't from around here. Caleb would have known. Folks didn't just appear out of nowhere in a country this wide. When she reached the fence, she paused, holding onto the top rail as though steadying herself. Her eyes lifted, dark and cautious, and finally she spoke, her voice low and almost hesitant. "I don't say much, sir, but I can cook." Caleb straightened, his hand still on the gate latch. He wasn't a man easy to surprise, but the bluntness of her words caught him. No name, no story, just that simple offer. He studied her in silence. Dust streaked her hem, and her boots had seen better days. She wasn't more than 20, maybe 21. There was something in her eyes that held his attention, not just weariness, but a guarded strength, as if she had learned not to waste words unless they mattered. "You can cook, you say?" His voice was rough from disuse. He wasn't used to talking much himself. She nodded once, her hands tightening around the satchel strap. "Meals. Bread. Stew. I can stretch little into much." Her gaze flickered, not quite meeting his, as though expecting dismissal. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. He wasn't in the habit of taking in strays, and women didn't wander to ranch gates without reason. Yet there was honesty in the way she stood, steady despite the dust on her clothes. "You're hired," he said at last. The relief that softened her face was so subtle he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching closely. She ducked her head slightly, as though hiding the flicker of emotion, and followed when he gestured toward the house. The Hart Ranch house was simple. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above, and a lean-to kitchen off the back. It had stood empty of a woman's touch for years. The shelves held only dried goods and a stack of dishes that Caleb's ranch hand, Tomas, washed now and then when reminded. The young woman set her satchel down near the kitchen door, brushing the dust from her dress. Without waiting for direction, she moved to the shelves, pulling out flour, beans, and lard. Her hands worked with a quiet confidence, and soon the sound of dough kneading replaced the creak of the house. Caleb leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and watched. She didn't chatter to fill the silence, nor did she shrink under his gaze. She worked with the steadiness of someone who knew the value of food to a tired man. "What do I call you?" he asked finally. She glanced up, a strand of hair falling loose from her braid. "Mara." "Mara what?" Her hands stilled a moment on the dough before she answered softly, "Just Mara." Caleb didn't press. Everyone out here had a past, and some pasts weren't worth dragging into the light. By evening, the table was set with bread still warm from the oven, beans stewed with bacon, and coffee strong enough to put heart into a man. Tomas, the ranch hand, whistled low when he came in and caught sight of the spread. "Well, ain't this a blessing?" he said, grinning at Mara. "You cook like this every night, miss, and I'll never leave." Mara only offered a small smile and turned back to the stove. She didn't answer. Caleb noticed. He also noticed how she never sat until he did, how her eyes flicked toward the door each time the wind rattled it, as if expecting someone or something on the other side. Over the next days, Mara's presence settled into the ranch like rain into dry earth. She rose before the sun, her soft footfalls the first sound in the kitchen. Biscuits and eggs greeted the men before they rode out, and in the evenings, stew or roasted meat filled the house with warmth it hadn't known in years. But more than the food, it was the quiet steadiness she brought. She didn't speak unless spoken to, yet when she did, her words carried weight. Caleb found himself listening more closely than he meant to, searching her few syllables for more than she gave. One night, after the men had gone to bed, Caleb lingered at the table. Mara was washing the last of the dishes, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. The lamplight touched her hair, turning the strands copper at the edges. "You runnin' from something?" he asked at last. Her hands stilled in the water. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the lamp. Then she said quietly, "A woman doesn't walk miles alone unless she is." That was all. No details, no tears. She returned to scrubbing the dish as though she hadn't spoken at all. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was a mystery, yes, but also a survivor. And out here, survival meant everything. He didn't push further. Instead, he said gruffly, "Well, you do good work. Keep the men fed, and you'll have a place here as long as you want it." Her eyes lifted, meeting his for the first time that night. In them was something he couldn't quite name, gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. She gave the smallest nod, and for the first time since she arrived, Caleb felt the house wasn't quite so empty. The days stretched into weeks. Summer turned hotter, storms rolled through, and the cattle demanded endless labor. Mara remained, a quiet, steady presence that neither asked nor offered too much. Yet slowly, Caleb found himself noticing the little things, the way she hummed under her breath when kneading dough, the careful stitching she did on a torn sleeve, the rare, fleeting smile when Tomas made some joke at supper. She didn't talk much, but in her silence she said more than most. And Caleb, a man who had long thought himself past needing anyone, began to wonder if hiring her hadn't been the first good decision he'd made in years. The sound of cattle bawling carried across the wide pasture. Caleb rode at the front of the herd, his shoulders tight as he guided them toward fresh grazing. A storm had torn through the valley 2 nights earlier, scattering fences and frightening the livestock. Half the herd had nearly bolted through broken rails. It had taken hours in the driving rain to pull them back, and Caleb still felt the ache in his bones. When he returned to the ranch, weary and soaked through, the windows glowed with lamplight. Mara had kept the fire burning. The smell of hot stew drifted out as he pushed the door open. She didn't fuss over him, didn't chatter the way women in town did when they saw a man half drowned. Instead, she simply set a towel on the chair by the stove and ladled stew into a bowl. "Eat," she said softly. Caleb sat, the warmth sinking into him with each spoonful. Mara busied herself with kneading bread at the table. The quiet between them wasn't heavy, it was steady, like the rhythm of hoofbeats across the plains. "You've a knack for making a man forget he near drowned," Caleb muttered after a while. Her lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile but near enough. "Food helps most things." He chuckled low. "Ain't that the truth?" The days after the storm were hard. Repairing fences, checking for strays, hauling branches from the pasture, it demanded every hand on the ranch. Mara worked beside them when she could, sleeves rolled, skirts muddy at the hem. She never complained, never once asked for more than what was given. At night, when the work was finally done, she'd sit by the fire with her mending. Caleb often found his eyes drifting to her, the lamplight softening the sharp angles of her face. There was gentleness in her hands, even when they bore the marks of labor. One evening, Tomas leaned close to Caleb as Mara stepped outside to fetch water. "She ain't like the others that pass through, boss," Tomas said in a low voice. "She's got staying in her. Don't let her slip off one day without a word. Caleb scowled, though not at Tomas. The thought had crossed his mind more than once. Mara was a mystery, yes, but one that had rooted herself into the ranch without trying, and into him, though he wasn't ready to admit it aloud. The test came sooner than he expected. A band of riders, 3 men Caleb had seen around town, known for drinking and picking fights, showed up one afternoon while Caleb and Tomas were mending fence on the far side of the property. Mara had been left at the house, baking bread and keeping watch over the smaller stock. By the time Caleb returned, he found her standing in the yard, a shotgun braced against her shoulder. The men were on their horses, muttering curses, one clutching his arm where the ground was freshly gouged. She hadn't missed, she'd chosen not to hit him. Caleb's blood ran hot. He spurred his horse forward, placing himself between her and the intruders. "You've had your fun," he growled. "Now ride out before I make sure you don't come back." They sneered, but something in his voice, and the fact Mara's aim still hadn't wavered, sent them wheeling their horses. Dust rose as they galloped off. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did Caleb turn. Mara lowered the shotgun slowly, her face pale but steady. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once. They wanted more than bread. Caleb swallowed hard. The image of her alone, standing against 3 men, dug deep into him. He reached out, steadying the barrel as she set the gun aside. "You did right," he said gruffly. "Better'n most men would have done." Her eyes lifted, searching his, and for the first time he saw something unguarded there. Fear, yes, but also trust. That night, the ranch was quiet. The men were on edge after the encounter, and Caleb paced the porch long after supper. Inside, Mara washed dishes with slow, careful motions. At last, he stepped in. She looked up, startled, as though she hadn't realized he'd been watching. "You carry in all this weight alone before you came here?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. "Alone is safer. Usually. Not out here." His voice softened. "Out here, you got to have someone to stand with." She studied him, her hands still in the basin. "And who stands with you, Caleb Hart?" The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "No one. Not for years." He cleared his throat. "Maybe that's changing." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then Mara dried her hands and crossed the room. She didn't speak, but she stood close enough he could see the fine lines of weariness around her eyes, the strength hidden beneath it. Caleb raised a hand, hesitated, then brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. "You don't have to talk much," he said softly. "I hear you clear enough." Her lips parted, as if she might finally answer, but instead she only leaned her forehead lightly against his chest. It was the smallest gesture, yet it felt like the world shifting under him. Weeks passed. The troublemakers didn't return, though Caleb kept watch. Mara's presence became as steady as the rising sun. She cooked, she worked, she laughed sometimes, quietly, but enough that Caleb felt it in his chest each time. One evening, as summer began to fade, they sat on the porch together. The sky burned gold and crimson, the land stretching endless before them. Mara spoke first, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "I used to think silence meant weakness, that if I didn't speak, I'd disappear." She paused, her gaze on the horizon. "But here, it doesn't feel that way." Caleb turned to her. "Out here, silence can be stronger than any words." She looked at him then, truly looked, and he knew she understood what he hadn't said aloud. Slowly, he reached for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers small but sure against his calloused palm. The ranch was quiet, the world wide, but in that moment neither of them felt alone. And though Mara had spoken little since the day she'd walked up his lane, The few words she whispered then carried more weight than any speech. "I think I've found where I belong." Caleb squeezed her hand gently, his chest tightening with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. "Then you'll stay," he said firmly. The last of the sun dipped below the ridge, and for the first time in a long time, the ranch felt like home.